Today I'm going to illustrate the idea of bias of technology that I discussed last time in relation to the labor process. We'll start by making a distinction between craft and industry. Until modern times, all labor had the characteristics of craft, handwork under the control of the craftsman with specialized skills and generally at home or in the neighborhood, on the farm, for example. Here the worker is the center, and the tools are assembled around the worker. The family is a work unit, and regulation, to the extent that it exists, is customary. And this is the way people lived, worked, and produced for tens of thousands of years. In recent times, we've moved on to a different system. It begins, for the most part, it's not really a common way to work until the late 18th, early 19th century in England, where there's a transition from craft methods to capitalist control. The capitalists at first simply assemble the craftsmen in factories. But this is the beginning of management, because the craft workers now are salaried employees and no longer have strong incentives to do a good job. Management is necessary to protect the factory, the interests of the factory owner. And from here, there's a transition in the 19th century to industry. And industry is characterized by the introduction of mechanical power and machines. And the machines now become the center around which the tools are organized rather than the worker. The workers are there to perform certain operations the machines can't perform, like moving things from one place to another. This results in the loss of the skills of the original craft labor. Those skills are now transposed into the machine, and the craftsmen lose their status as a result. Adam Smith wrote about this in the late 18th century. He presented what is now the standard view, according to which the transition from craft to industry was motivated by the pursuit of efficiency. Dividing labor, Adam Smith argued, makes each worker more productive, so the total output is increased. Too bad if that also makes the work boring and the wages low. That's simply a side effect of technical advance. And Smith gave the example of pin making. And curiously, the pin making process that Smith described is depicted on the British 20-pound note. So here it is. You can see in the center the little pin makers, each with his own piece of the work. There's an alternative view of the transition, and this view holds that it is not a question of efficiency, but rather control of the labor force. Control problems motivated the creation of factories and the introduction of machines. Craft workers had autonomy, and since they owned their own tools, they had an incentive to work. That was their way of earning an income. Salaried workers, on the other hand, have no particular incentive to do a good job because they're paid a wage and they don't own the product of their own labor, as the craft worker did. They can't sell it. It's sold by the capitalist who employs them. And for this reason, they must be controlled. And here's where management comes in. There are all kinds of problems management had to deal with. The theft of time, it's called soldiering in American industry. Workers not doing their job as much as they possibly can avoid it. The theft of tools and materials, all of this, these are problems that management is supposed to solve. This is all explained by Andrew Ewer in 1835. I'll read you a passage from his book, The Philosophy of Manufactures. It'll give you a chance also to see how English used to be written. Here's Ewer. By the infirmity of human nature, it happens that the more skillful the workman, the more self-willed and intractable he is apt to become, and of course, the less fit a component of a mechanical system, in which, by occasional irregularities, he may do great damage to the whole. The grand object, therefore, of the modern manufacturer is, through the union of capital and science, to reduce the task of his workpeople to the exercise of vigilance and dexterity. Well, there's an alternative account in Marxism of this argument about the control problems. And this account was developed in recent times by two Marxist social thinkers, Harry Braverman and David Noble. They argue that Marx himself rejected the efficiency argument. The origins of the industrial labor process, according to them, lie in class struggle. Why? Because capitalism can control machine design and use that control to de-skill labor and to make it easier to control. The capitalist will inevitably choose designs that enhance control, and this is not a domain in which workers had any say until quite recently. Here's a text from Marx that states the thesis. The development of the means of labor into machinery is not an accidental moment of capital, but is rather the historical reshaping of the traditional inherited means of labor into a form adequate to capital. The accumulation of knowledge and of skill of the general productive forces of the social brain is thus absorbed into capital as opposed to labor, and hence appears as an attribute of capital. In machinery, knowledge appears as alien, external to him, that is to say the worker, and living labor as subsumed under self-activated, objectified labor. This is what is generally called alienation. The type of human being who lives in a society is relative to social conditions. Capitalism freed workers from serfdom and religion and gave them a chance to think for themselves, but the division of labor it introduced degrades the workers into a condition of quasi-slavery, that is, in the 19th century. They produce the society, but find it dominating them. This is what Marx meant by alienation. And here's an illustration of the kind of work process that Marx deplored. Well, this leads to resistance because capitalism is inherently an unstable society. Workers who can think for themselves are condemned in practice to a near slavery, and obviously this is going to lead to problems. The labor movement develops as a result, and its struggles shape our society. As a result of those struggles, all sorts of things have been done to make the condition of labor far less onerous. The last great labor struggle that had a revolutionary character was in France in May of 1968. There was a general strike and very nearly a revolution. So this is close to our own time. Here you can see the workers in an occupied factory asserting their will. Well, David Noble provides us with a text on the automation of machine tools. And his text is an interesting illustration of the thesis that control problems are at the heart of technical advance under capitalism. Machine tools are hard to automate. It's a very highly skilled work process. There are two ways to do it. One is to record what the workers do on their machine and then use the recording to operate a whole bunch of machines. There's a second way. That's to computerize the automation based on the engineering drawings that the workers are charged with implementing on their machines. If you could go straight from the engineering drawing to the machine, you could get rid of the worker. Noble shows that the record playback system was far superior for many years, but managers didn't like it. They insisted on computerization, even at considerable expense. Why? Noble argues, to eliminate those self-willed and intractable workers, as Ure calls them. This concerns you too, because professors may be the last self-willed and intractable workers. There are two modes of online education. There are automated systems in which machines replace humans, and there are interactive systems, like the one we're using, in which humans use machines. Well, there's no clear decision yet as to which system is going to prevail in universities. We'll have to wait and see the outcome of the current debates over online education, now that it's so generally employed. Here's a picture of automated online education I found in an Army manual, a training manual. And you can see that it is a completely dehumanized concept of how to learn. Well, just to conclude, Marx thought that the workers would eventually take over and replace capitalism because it could not satisfy all their needs. And he imagined a system he called socialism, in which the economy is planned, workers control their workplaces, and there's a democratic political system. The Soviet model of communism had planning, but it didn't have workers' control and it didn't have democracy. So it's not a good realization of Marx's idea of socialism. There really are no models. All the experiments were blocked or failed. While Yugoslavia was under communism, it had worker control and planning, but no democracy. The 1968 movement in France promised a worker-controlled democratic socialist society, but the movement was defeated before it could take power. In Chile, socialists took over in 1970 and ruled the country for 3 years, and they did introduce a measure of worker control and democracy, but the experiment ended in a coup organized by the United States that established a fascist regime in Chile. Climate change now raises the question of socialism again, because there are many people who doubt that capitalism can accommodate the need for climate change mitigation. There's no real answer to the question of how this is going to work out, but it's interesting that there's quite a bit of discussion of socialism now, even after the long-term failure of the various experiments. So that's the end for today, and we'll do another example of the bias of technology next time.